second speaker is Siddharth Peter de Souza. He recently was a postdoctoral researcher at Tilburg University and is moving on to being a assistant professor at the University of Warwick starting in January next year. And Siddharth will talk about data-related practices and data sharing and what red lines we need to set on the table to prevent, I would say, bad uses of data, exploitative uses of data. Sorry. Siddharth, the floor is yours for 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sylvain. I'll just share my screen. All right. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak. My name is Siddharth de Souza, and the work that I'll present today is done in collaboration with my colleague Lynette Taylor when I was working at Tilburg University. My presentation is titled Norm Making Around Data Governance, Proposals for Red Lines. And I think in a way it is a good segue from the end of Natalie's presentation, because I would also like to speak a little bit about the notion of counterpower. So the key questions in my presentation are as follows. Firstly, I'd like to talk about if we are thinking about datafied societies and if we are thinking about the possibilities for use and thinking about legitimate and illegitimate use, what kind of fundamental and enforceable rules may exist in order to ensure that we can be able to highlight these kind of questions. What are the processes through which such rules can emerge? Who determines them? What kind of roles do they play? And then finally, what sets rules apart from other rules? I would like to talk about the notion of red lines. I want to talk about the notion of norms. So what is it about red lines and norms that make them different and make them different specifically in terms of the power that they have to be able to establish certain guardrails in terms of how we think about how data flows within democratic societies and across the globe more generally. So firstly, let me begin by saying a little bit about this notion of norms and how we understand norms. So I would like to introduce norms as being those frameworks that allow us to make claims, they allow us to organize around a particular issue, they also allow us to articulate grievances. Norms can be understood more broadly as standards for appropriate behavior. And there are two particular aspects that are relevant for this presentation. One is that norms play the role of having a constitutive function, in that they can construct a particular world, they can determine criteria for behavior, they can create categories, they can determine functions. The second aspect of norms is that they have a constraining function in the sense that they can limit behavior, they can determine what is permissible, what is impermissible. And this notion of permissibility is also central towards thinking about how we can understand norms as being different from other kinds of rules. In international law, we have the notion of jus cogens norms, which are norms from which no derogation or change is possible. They place an emphasis on the fact of compelling law that directs behavior, that ensures adherence, and that they have a sort of fundamental character that is so intrinsic that they have a higher importance to others. We see these norms as they approach every day around us. These norms can be in the form of prohibitions on slavery, on apartheid, on piracy, on genocide, on wars of aggression. And therefore, these norms have this certain gravity that are so essential to protecting human dignity that any derogation from them will result in situations that there will be behavior that must be called out to be illegitimate. So to begin this presentation, very fundamentally, this notion of norms is something that is so fundamental that it allows us to imagine and determine what are the ways in which we can constitute worlds and forms of regulation. So when it comes to data, who is really making norms for data? Classically, one can look at norm making really from the perspective of states, and states have been enforcing norms, whether it is to do with the Geneva Conventions, the human rights frameworks, nuclear tests, bans. But norms are also now taking place, particularly in the aspect of data regulation at different sub-levels. We see this in the form of internet governance forums. We see this in the form as through Natalie's presentation, the fact that you have big tech that is also using its power and using its lobbying and using its market reach to be able to also influence the ways in which we think about norms by creating additionally also institutions for self-regulation. For instance, Meta has the oversight board, which is almost a parallel structure to think about norms and think about regulation and to think about ways in which they determine what can be permissible or not. There's also the question of intellectual property, which again, and we saw this from the OpenAI example, which determines about who actually owns data. How do we actually think about notions of ownerships, flow, circulation? But the question that we want to ask, and this becomes particularly relevant also given that last week there was also the passing of the Global Digital Compact at the United Nations, is what is it that is an overarching standard for what is fundamentally unacceptable when we think about questions of data governance? What is it that is at its core which determines what is legitimate and illegitimate when it comes to norm making, when it comes to data governance regulation? So a lot of organizations are thinking about a global data governance framework. We are seeing this, for instance, with the World Trade Organization that is coming up with regulation in terms of digital trade. We're also seeing increasingly UNESCO, for example, which has come up with an AI ethics recommendation, which determines how to actually think about ethics from a multilateral perspective that looks at questions of pluralism, that looks at questions of multiculturality, that is also interested in thinking about in what ways can we think about ethics in terms of how they work at a local level as well. We have the example of the EU AI Act, which looks at ways to regulate the EU market, but also increasingly one needs to think about in how far does the fact that the EU AI Act regulating the European market also have implications for the globe in terms of the extraterritorial effects of the fact that the EU is an important market and in an important market that determines also relations with countries around it. And we've seen this very clearly, for instance, with the GDPR and data protection regulation, where it's not just regulating for Europe, but it also has consequences for countries that trade with Europe. The African Union is another example which has come up with data protection policy. And what is interesting here is also an emphasis on the notion of social justice in thinking about in what ways can we think about global regulating for at a regional level and at a global level. All of these make up different kinds of frameworks. But one thing that is very clear and constitutive of all these different approaches is a fundamental assumption that when we think about data, we are thinking about data as a commodity that requires to flow. And it flows in a manner that will be the case unless we also have national laws that take into account questions, for instance, of data sovereignty, data nationalism, data localization. So if data is seen fundamentally as an economic commodity that can be traded and can be shared, and there must be it must be seen to be something that has value, and of course the oft used phrase of data being the new oil, can we actually imagine new kinds of visions to looking beyond data as being a resource? So the first one that we prescribe and think about is actually the notion of data as people. For instance, to draw from the work of Robert Kozak, he says in his work that when he was looking at files, files are something that are not just files, but they are something that actually connect to people's human lives, that are worthy of respect, that are worthy of being able to give representation to what that life had been. Floridi speaks about the fact that when we talk about my and my data, it's not the same as my and my car because of the constitutive role that data plays in terms of determining who we are. We Are Not Numbers, a Gaza-based youth organization, has this very powerful line, which I will quote, where they say, when the world speaks about Palestinians living under occupation and in refugee camps, it is usually in terms of politics and numbers, specifically how many killed, injured, homeless, and or dependent on aid. But numbers are impersonal and often numbing. What they do not convey are the daily personal struggles and triumphs, the tears and the laughter and the aspirations that are so universal that if it weren't for the context, they would immediately resonate with virtually everyone. And so The first aspect that I'd like to talk about as a counter to this notion of data as an economic commodity is the fact that within data is also the fact that there are lives of people that need to be represented. The second aspect is the aspect of data as labor. And we have seen, and this has been studied by several researchers across the globe, about the fact that when actually ChatGPT was launched, there was a lot of studies that spoke about how workers in Kenya were paid very poor wages, $2 an hour, were not given the necessary protections to ensure that they were actually able to 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 know and also be able to then deal with the kind of content that they had to suffer through. So it's not just a question of the fact that this content had devastating effects for workers' mental health, but they were also exploited in terms of wages. So AI development is also uh, something that runs on the unseen labor of an army of workers who are labeling data in order to feed models. There is also the fact that when we actually think about engagement with data technologies, whether it is to do with social media, whether it is to do with how we use shopping apps, for instance, an Uber or a delivery app, each of this is an engagement that constitutes and should be seen as data labor in terms of how we're contributing to the development of the algorithm. So the second aspect that I'd like to put forward is this notion of data is labor. And the third is the aspect of data as social relations, where we also understand that the way in which data is being used, the way in which it circulates, also has implications for social relations that are caused. If we look at the work of Coldry and Mayes, but also from Tierra Común, a civil society organization, data colonialism is also based on social relations that emerge under capitalism. Um, when we are thinking about datafied systems, we're also thinking about how we place ourselves in relation with others. As Salome Veon says, what are the ways in which this makes it possible or not to be able to manipulate certain kinds of relationships, to be able to monetize certain kinds of relationships? And therefore, what data is also telling us is not just a story of an individual, but a story about associations, about networks, about the ways in which we interact and intervene with different people. So, having said this, what I'd like to put forward, and this is where a new site of thinking about where norm making is emerging around data is from civil society. And we do this also, and why I hope this is relevant for this panel on democracy is also the aspect of thinking about democratic spaces from which norms are emerging, and civil society being one where not just passive recipients of laws and regulations, but active generators of knowledge about how we need to regulate digital economies. So a few references here. One is, for instance, from the non-aligned technology movement and Tierra Común, which say that can we actually imagine a future where the terrain of human life does not involve the extraction of data that discriminates between us and separates us from our own lives. So instead, what is the potential for a purposeful engagement of digital technologies in a way that raises and affirms community power, that talks about questions of self-determination? This aspect also relates to the work from the Maori Data Sovereignty Network, which speaks about data as something that is living, that constitutes relationships to environments, to lands, to people, to ancestry, which all must be protected because when these are produced, they're also useful to the group as a whole. So to also think about data as something that has implications across and beyond thinking about what it means for an individual, but also for the communities at large. And in that regard, who really determines how one actually takes decisions around what kind of regulation and what kind of red lines are necessary when it comes to data? IT for Change, a group from India, speaks about when we think about data and we say that data is used to create economic value, in what ways is this value actually tied to the citizens? And in what ways are we saying that this is actually being alienated from them? So the question we ask is, if civil society and if from these ideas that I've shared with you were to think about norm making instead of states, what would such norm making look like? And there have been different examples of bottom up norm entrepreneurship. This has emerged from the abolitionist movement, the anti apartheid movement, from feminist movement. And what we are seeing in each of the examples that I've shared with you, but in our paper we speak about a few more, is the argument that what is emerging is this idea that data cannot be separated from the interests of those that it represents. And therefore we borrow this notion from the disability movement of nothing about us without us. And what we want to ask is, in what ways can we actually enforce a norm of nothing about us without us, particularly when we think about, and as in the previous presentation, the myriad of interests that exist, whether it is to do with the interests of states, whether it is to do with the interests of regional conglomerations, whether it is to do with the interests of private actors. How do we actually ensure that the interests of those whose data is being produced and circulated also have a stake in determining what are the implications of such data? And therefore, in what ways can we think about the effects that would emerge if such a norm was enforced? How can actually a civil society norm making process be formalized? And also, one of the key questions, particularly in thinking about this from a democratic standpoint, is what kind of voices are we interested in making more visible? What kind of voices are already marginal to the process of norm making? And how can we actually ensure that these voices are given prominence to ensure that different kinds of perspectives come to the table? So the norm of nothing about us without us, to tell you a little bit more, is the idea that can we actually ensure that communities, whether they're geographic, identity, or interest based, are being able to assert principles for governing data technologies. We see this as a plural response to data fied exploitation, for extractivism, because it accounts for the fact that in any norm making process, there will be contestation, and we must see contestation as being a benefit to building something that actually represents diverse communities. Can civil society have the authority to be able to use and refuse technologies? We spoke previously about the fact that there are alternative platforms that may exist to an open AI, but in what ways can these alternative platforms be supported? What kind of ways in which these alternative platforms can be sustainable, and how can they be of interest to people to ensure that there is also visions that can be more open, can be more deliberative? So, two things that I'd like to say. One is that can we actually think about this notion of inalienability, that data is actually inseparable from people? And if we do so, in what ways can we ensure that we are cognizant of the fact that it structures and systematizes relations between people? So, in order to operationalize this norm, we speak about both governing of data as well as being governed in a datafied world. What are the ways in which voice and the lived experiences of people can be made more acknowledged in decision making processes? In what ways can such decisions result in people being able to claim control, especially those who are directly affected? And how can we actually govern technology in a way that is flexible and plural? Because if we are thinking about this as a global problem, we have to acknowledge the fact that there are global interests at play. So, can we actually move away from a universalizing set of statements about data governance, but move to thinking really about a decontextualized approach? And here I draw from Amartya Sen, who speaks about, can we actually move beyond thinking about a set of institutions, which is niti, and can we move to nyaya, which is really how regulation emerges in practice, in societies, and in different contexts? Finally, if we are to really practice a pluralist approach to data governance, and this image is taken from a note of the first planning meeting of the non-aligned tech movement, what are the ways in which we are able to bring different voices in when it comes to the development of technologies, as well as experiences with deployment of technology? What are the ways in which we are able to engage with people who are minoritized in tech, and oftentimes they are in the global majority? And how are we able to bring these different perspectives and these different imaginaries, these different epistemologies? Can we actually create coalitions and spaces for greater awareness about what governance is, how governance is practiced? Can we think about spaces for alternative tech? And then finally, what are the ways in which, when we think about policy tables, we are also thinking not just about the existing policy tables and having token representation, but also about creating new policy tables. And in this instance, the role of civil society organizations as norm entrepreneurs in thinking about new visions for data governance. Thank you.